A lot of people don't understand how big tech bias actually works. Now, there are some overt instances of bias where we see like a leaked email from Project Veritas where someone at Google refers to Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Prager University as you-know-who far-right extremists. That's overt, that we can see. There have been instances where there's a clear bias in who gets banned from certain platforms. Say Twitter, for instance, Learn to Code, it's all very obvious. Interestingly now, we are actually seeing the media finally loop back around to reality and admit, are Google and Facebook censoring conservatives? The problem is more widespread than that. And they're correct, saying the social media giants say they don't want to regulate political speech, but they already are. This article is actually pretty good. And I'll tell you why. The bias of big tech has to do with the targeting of words and ideas, not individuals. I pointed this out on the Joe Rogan podcast. I said, your rules to Jack Dorsey are biased against conservatives. And he said, how? And I said, the misgendering policy. And he said, oh, but we look at studies and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you look at. More than half the country disagrees with you. You have chosen a rule set that is at odds with the worldview of the other half of the country. You're not looking at conservatives and going, aha, him, ban him. No, you're saying that idea held by you and your group for the most part, eliminate. That's how the bias works. And I'll give you some examples before we read the story. A really great example would be this story. Google tried censoring gun shopping searches. It backfired. February 27, 2018. Let's talk about the bias against conservatives. Who is more likely to be shopping for firearms and firearm accessories? Not liberals, who tend to be in favor of gun control. Now, admittedly, there are a lot of liberals who are pro-gun, for sure. Or I hate saying liberal, but leftists and liberals. But for the most part, you're going to find it falls onto the conservative base who are pro-2A, which means when Google decides you can't search for the word gun, it is primarily affecting conservatives. Google decides that a certain politician stories shouldn't emerge in search, and they censor the autofilter, the auto search. That is a bias in favor of, say, the Democrats. Now, we don't know necessarily in terms of that who they're doing it to more, but we do know Google is in Silicon Valley. They tend to be on the left. They're a massive, powerful corporation, and they do little things like this all the time. They filter search results. They remove certain people. They spread lies. They favor CNN. We know how this works. If CNN chooses to show, if Google chooses to show CNN in searches 1/5 of the time, well, CNN is politically biased. There's third-party fact-checking organizations that say CNN falls on the left. They're not centrist. And they push a lot of the same far left rhetoric as many of these digital outlets. But let this be the perfect example for you. It's not so much in the broader sense that someone at Google is like, we must get rid of every conservative. It's that they're saying guns are bad and should be banned. Well, guess what? Guess which political party tends to favor gun rights? And that's how the game is played. Now, interestingly, the Washington Post actually talks about this. They say, the White House recently hosted a social media summit inviting about 200 conservatives and right-wing activists to discuss their allegations that Facebook and Twitter censor their messaging. Also, they also invited a small handful of liberals, because I wasn't the only one. The summit capped a year of charges by the right that Silicon Valley tech firms have a liberal bias. But these charges come in the face of considerable evidence that conservative news outlets outperform others on social media. Fact. Last week, the charges turned bipartisan. Rep. Tulsi Gabbard, a Democratic presidential candidate, filed a $50 million lawsuit against Google, alleging that a temporary account suspension infringed on her free speech. More importantly, that suspension infringed on a presidential campaign. That is the nightmare reality that is Google. But I want to stress something. They like to, I don't know if they do that here or if it's another article where they're like, clearly Tulsi Gabbard being suppressed flies in the face of the conservative narrative. No. The narrative is, yes, they're biased against conservatives. It doesn't mean they're not biased against Tulsi Gabbard. It just means they're biased against conservatives. Guess what? Two things can be true at the same time. Because as I've stated over and over and over again, you know who the real bias is against? Anyone who doesn't hold the identitarian left-wing pro-war establishment view. Now, of course, some people will get by, but look at who faces the brunt. Maffick Media, left-wing anti-war media. Tulsi Gabbard, left-wing anti-war presidential candidate. Look who is on the Pinterest censorship list. Veritas revealed Live Action, a pro-life group, but also the antimedia.com anti-war. And now here's the kicker. Guess what? Guess what other big base happens to be anti-war? Trump's base. Remember when Trump was going to strike Iran and Tucker Carlson said don't do it or something to that effect? And so Trump decided not to? Something happened, I don't have the details, because it was like a couple weeks ago, where something like Tucker Carlson said something to the effect of, if you go to war with Iran, you will not get reelected. Something like that. Trump's base does not like war, though they do support the president when he does engage in a lot of these things. The long story short, I think the real issue is the war machine is what they're trying to protect. And now here's the thing. When you have these left-wing intersectional types, they don't care for war. They will smear Tulsi Gabbard all day and night because she's the only one up there saying no, no, no. So that's how the game is played as far as I'm concerned. But let's read on. They say, our research reveals one likely reason. Facebook and Google don't make clear either their guidelines or reasoning for accepting or rejecting paid political content or the process by which they make those decisions. This lack of transparency may lead outsiders to believe the worst, especially when tech chief executives make political statements that don't accord with their prospective customers' beliefs. But they go on to say, Google bans inappropriate content, such as intimidation and discrimination, but it says nothing about what these things mean in practice. So when you start talking about, I think they actually get into talking about weapons like AR-15 in particular, but let's read. They say, over the past 2 years, we interviewed former employees of Facebook and Google and political practitioners from campaigns, political organizations, and digital political consultancies. We also analyzed email exchanges between Facebook and campaigns to investigate how these firms moderate paid political speech, such as campaign advertising. We focused on advertising or paid content, the domain where these companies are likely to have the most formal policies and transparency around the decision. They say, here's one example. Political practitioners told us that advertising that focuses on the politics of assault rifles, for or against, might run afoul of Google's rules. At Google, algorithms vet most advertising for inappropriate content. When an algorithm flags an ad, it then goes to human reviewers. If reviewers reject the ad, they give very little explanation, failing to clarify, for instance, why an ad about the politics of assault rifles counts as inappropriate content. As a result, campaigns don't know how to design ads that meet the standards. That limits the range of political topics on which politicians can campaign. Yes. Think about what Twitter did to Donald Trump, saying they were going to put a flag on tweets that break the rules. They're saying today, keep in mind, if you speak like the president, you will never be president. They're saying the president technically isn't allowed to be on their platform. One of the biggest public discourse communications platforms in the country. That is a psychotic precedent to set. They say keeping the rules vague allows these firms maximum flexibility to interpret their own rules. The campaign staffers we interviewed reported that company representatives generally do not explain or justify these decisions. Journalists, researchers, and individuals who have an interest in how platforms moderate political speech remain largely in the dark. So think about Google, who bans the word gun from search results. Now think about someone putting an ad up that is pro-gun, anti-gun control, saying we have a Second Amendment right. It gets flagged because it has the word gun in it. It goes to a human reviewer who sees it and sees them saying, you should go buy guns, you should be allowed to own them, it is your right under the Constitution, and they think, whoa, it's promoting gun use? We've already banned guns from the shop. We're not going to allow the word gun in advertisements. Delete. But then think about the inverse, where they're like, guns are bad. We shouldn't have guns. Google says, that's exactly why we banned the word gun from search. We agree. You see how the bias works? It's not that they're going to conservatives individually and saying, get rid of them, though they are. But like in the broader context, the rules are being set. The tracks are being laid. And if you don't deal with this today, in 10 years, there will be no ads for pro-life, for guns, for any conservative position. Now, many people would say, well, is Tim defending the conservatives? Because for one, I believe in the right to free expression and fair and honest elections. I don't believe my morality trumps anyone on the left or the right, for the most part. Or I should clarify this. I certainly think I have better opinions than everyone else, as we all do. But I don't believe I have the moral authority to impose my will on anyone, be it far left or far right. Though I think we can come together, argue for our ideas, and win, in the long run, to establish societal norms and what is right and wrong. I don't believe that I should be able to shut down someone else's expression because I have more authority than they do. That makes no sense. However, there are a lot of people that do, and they use systems in this way that grant them that power. More importantly, though, Conservatives, whatever. Whatever. Okay, fine. Let them be banned. And you know what comes next? Tulsi Gabbard. And that is the most important point. I will absolutely stand up for those who are having their expression stripped, who are being, accused of, hate speech or whatever, because I know what happens next. The people I like are standing in line to be pushed off the cliff, same as everybody else. There was a famous poem. First they came for, we know how it goes. They're going to get rid of conservatives, and then they're going to come for the anti-war left, and that is what we are seeing. So they try and make this seem more about how it's policing speech in general, but let's be real. As I presented to you, when it comes to a pro-life ad, trying to explain why they think it's wrong and show images, for instance, of what happens in an abortion, of course Google's going to reject that. And there you go. The conservative view will be restricted, whereas the pro-choice people will just speak on emotion and the rights, and they'll show images of women smiling. Those images aren't, controversial, and they'll be accepted. Thus, the soft, safe space room with pastel walls and stuffed animals is what will get approved every single time. And the harsh realities of the world will not be approved. So anybody campaigning, anybody who holds ideas that are controversial but that still need to be heard, you will be left out and your ideas will cease to exist. That is the bias of social media. And you can look at the trans debate. Look at Mario Lopez. Mario Lopez said, parents should decide for themselves, but I just think kids aren't old enough to know. And then they attacked him for it a month later. And he apologized. How insane is that? So you want to talk about bias? I think the fact that Mario Lopez apologized shows you the real bias. He knows what he has to do to survive in media. What do you think comes next? That's all I got to say. That's what it's going to be like. Here's a good example, actually, of some more. When Elizabeth Warren called out Facebook, they say shortly after, Facebook removed her ads that called for the company to be broken up, claiming the ads violated rules against using the Facebook logo. After an outcry, Facebook restored the ads. So let me make it clear. It's conservatives today, it's the anti-war tomorrow, and it's anyone who dare oppose the big tech oligopoly. That's why we cannot allow them to continue. And yes, they are biased. The reality is they're biased against everyone but themselves. If they could just make themselves rich and powerful, that's what they would support. As long as the left defends their authoritarian policies, they're not going to go after them. But conservatives challenge it, so they increasingly say, enough, we're not going to allow you to speak. Anyway, I think it's interesting that Washington Post wrote this article, now admitting the problem is actually worse than just censoring conservatives. They don't do a good enough job, in my opinion, but at least they bring up a very important issue. Google, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, whatever. They don't need to say in the rules conservatives are banned. They can say something like no red hats. What if that was a rule? No red hats allowed. It has nothing to do with conservatives. We just think red hats are bad. Well, there you go. Trump supporters out. You see how they can play the game. Anyway, stick around. I'm going to be expanding a bit about, on the smear campaigns against Tulsi Gabbard, coming up at 4 p.m. And yes, I'll be talking about tech. So that will be at youtube.com/Timcast. Thanks for hanging out. I will see you there.